Yeah, so apologies, I had a work meeting go long, so it's just the way life has been for me lately. But I'm excited to dive into 2.8 and get into neurosis and psychosis, which I think will be, in theory, exciting. I don't know, maybe. Before we dive in, before I get started, any announcements, anything anyone wants to bring up and chat about before we actually get into Anti-Oedipus properly? I will start streaming the text in a second. I know I'm not streaming yet, but it will be in a moment. But if anyone has any comments, I figured we'd start with that as I'm getting most of my other crap set up.
Yeah, while you're doing that, I'll give two brief ones. The literature group will be reading Foucault's Disappearance of the Author for Saturday at noon PDT, and the Guattari group, who I keep forgetting to announce for, I'm going to change that starting this week. We'll be working on, I think it's Machinic Unconscious. There's an essay we're reading over there for Friday at, oh boy, 2 p.m. PST.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. And I think we've got a lot of things happening. We have our new Guattari group that went very well. We have our Deleuze group, which is great. I highly suggest join the server. Our Foucault group, I think, Zach moved the main one, so now we only have 5 instead of 26 Foucault groups. I don't know how we have a lot of crap going on.
But next week, or rather this week on Saturday at 7 p.m. Pacific time in the Deleuze and Deleuze reading group, we will be having a review of the first section of the Tao Te Ching chapters, or verses 1 through 38, or rather 37, I'm sorry. And we'll be finishing up the last 2 of those and then having an overall review of that section. So it'd be a good week to hop in if you have missed the first few.
Excellent. Excellent, excellent, excellent. All right. This is going to be fun. So, we've now moved out of the last handful, the last, I think, 3 weeks were spent on the last section as we went over the final synthesis, conjunction, consummation. That was a lot. I spent last night re-editing and finally catching up on all of that. It was a lot to listen through. It was a lot to go through. But now we're able to move on a little bit. We're diving a bit more into neurosis and psychosis as we continue into the story of how the way that representations manifest within the realm of desire, the way that manifestations of such things play with us, fuck with us, destroy our desiring machines, and how they sort of work within our unconscious. Within this, we're going to be moving into the 5th paralogism, I believe, paralogism of the afterword, if it gets to me. But that is all to come. With any luck, we'll actually get through the section today. Please, at any point, if you have questions, don't hesitate to raise your hand by just typing in chat. I'm keeping an eye on it. We all are. Also, for those watching on YouTube, feel free. I'm also watching the chats and comments there, so feel free to say hi and say any other stuff you got going on. I think that'll be it, and I'm going to go ahead and dive in. So, we'll begin with neurosis and psychosis. In 1924, Freud proposed a simple criterion for distinguishing between neurosis and psychosis. In neurosis, the ego obeys the requirements of reality and stands ready to repress the drives of the id, whereas in psychosis, the ego is under the sway of the id, ready to break with reality. Freud's ideas often took quite some time before making their way into France. Not this one, however. That same year, Capris and Carret presented a case of schizophrenia with the delusion of doubles, where the patient manifested a strong hatred for her mother and an incestuous desire for her father, but under conditions of reality loss where the parents were lived as false parents or doubles. From this, they drew the illustration that the inverse relationship, the illustration of the inverse relationship. In neurosis, the object function of reality is preserved, but on condition that the causal complex be repressed. in psychosis, the complex invades consciousness and becomes its object, at the price of a repression that now bears on reality itself or the function of the real. Doubtless, Freud was merely insisting on the schematic character of the distinction, for the rupture is also found in neurosis with the return of the repressed, hysterical amnesia, obsessional cancellation, while in psychosis, a regaining of reality appears along with the delirious reconstruction. The fact remains that Freud never dropped this simple distinction, and it seems important that, following an original path, Freud encounters again an idea dear to traditional psychiatry, that madness is fundamentally linked to a loss of reality. Thus, there is a convergence with the psychiatric elaboration of the notions of dissociation and autism, hence the reason, perhaps, for the rapid diffusion the Freudian account enjoyed. Very quick thing I want to make sure I note on, because we had this discussion last time, I just want to nip it in the bud. Autism here is not, the medical terms used here are not the medical terms as we may know them in common modern parlance. Autism and dissociation have some similarities in terms of like how they're sort of used, but autism here is catatonia, effectively, as far as we discussed last time. Please tell me if I'm wrong on any of that, but it's a little bit different than what we tend to sort of consider autism today, at least as a broad spectrum sort of diagnosis. But with that note, I'm going to ask what anyone sees as the point of this paragraph. What is he trying to convey? I have some ideas on this. But I'm just opening it up for a moment. Ken? I feel like Ken wants to say something, but he's going to type it instead.
He's on a business and pleasure call.
Of course. He's always working. All right, so I'll throw out some thoughts on this paragraph. The opening here is talking about how we view neurosis and psychosis from a psychoanalytic perspective. On the one side, they talk early on about Freud saying that, just to say very clearly, in neurosis, the ego obeys the requirements of reality and stands ready to repress the drives of the id. Neurotic is a person who absolutely is attached within reality and is sort of within that and able to have sort of that's the space they live in, and they're basically repressing their neurotic tendencies, the id, the drives underneath them. The other direction is psychosis, where the ego is fully under sway of the id, ready to break with reality. This switch, they then talk about, very quickly moved on to France, where the illustration of the inverse relationship. In neurosis, the object function of reality is preserved, but on condition that causal complex be repressed. A neurotic, in this case, is one that has the complex. If it's able to be repressed, they have this repression happening with them, and reality is only able to be preserved if they are able to have that complex repressed, say, Oedipus complex. In psychosis, the complex invades consciousness and becomes its object. The complex becomes essentially reality to them, the price of a repression that bears on reality itself. Now repression is actually about reality. They're repressing reality in favor of the complex. This is what causes psychosis, according to Capgras and Correct. It's a very specific sort of juxtaposition they're setting up for what is to come as we start discussing how Oedipus plays a role within neurosis and psychosis, and then also how the neurotic and the psychotic play possibly within a slightly different mentality if we were to break this down in a schizoanalytic way, which we will be doing. This is just the first paragraph. That's my breakdown of it, if anyone agrees or disagrees. I'm going to sit awkwardly for a moment, because I feel like I'd love anyone to be like, hey.
This is what happens when Twin Peaks enters the chat. Right, everybody goes silent. But I like where you're off to. I'm reading a little bit differently in the sense that we're talking about. So they're talking about how Freud. This seems to get into Freud's use of like the reality and the pleasure principle, right? Where the id works with the pleasure principle, right? So we're talking about desire and a source of desire, going all the way back to 1.1, right? What a mistake to have said the id. And we're talking about how there's the pleasure principle is there for the Freudian schema, and how the id works with that, but how the ego works through the reality principle, right? So the id will put forward a drive, right? And the ego's got to use the reality principle to kind of direct that, right? So this makes you a neurotic because you can at least do something about your drives, right? In a certain sense of speaking, right? Because they're talking about consciousness here. Whereas for the psychotic, right, the ego goes with the drives. So where I see Oedipus coming in here, right, because we've talked about desire as the production of the real here, right? And so this is interesting, as what they seem to be pointing out here is the production of the real is going to be, in a sense, the states for Oedipus, as I'm reading this, because when Oedipus enters this, right, like it sounds like the id doesn't start Oedipalized here, but with Oedipus we kind of have more so like the conditions of pleasure and reality that Oedipus is going to work through, or rather work with here.
I think I can get with that. The second half of the paragraph where they start talking about, that Freud was merely insisting on the schematic character of the distinction. He says, the rupture is found in neurosis with the return of the repressed, the obsessive sort of nature of the way that the repressed sort of rupture in reality continues to push back on the neurotic, while the psychotic, the delirious reconstruction is how reality sort of comes along with this sort of rupture in that setup. And to them, Freud never dropped the distinction between kind of these setups. And the final point here is, I think, the important part is that madness is fundamentally linked to a loss of reality. And that's the thing that they keep pointing towards for all of this, that it's about, madness is about a disconnect from reality, the rupture from reality, whatever it may be. And that's kind of, I think, the end of their point here. They finish, hence the reason perhaps for the rapid diffusion that Freudian account enjoyed. This is sort of the natural way we view dissociation, or at the time especially they viewed autism as being, they simply can't engage with reality. This is, people were assuming this about madness in general. They can't have reality, they've got to have something wrong with them. Reality is, we'll come to see, and they've already discussed, it's the social, the socius, the social network that they're part of, and their ability to sort of take it in a healthy way, which is kind of where a lot of this comes from, at least in the Freudian side.
Yeah, and this is kind of interesting, right? Because we're seeing how Oedipus here, in terms of repression and that, right? Part of what Oedipus works with is the states of reality and desire, right? So just like you're saying, right, dissociation from reality, right, which is going to be madness here, is something like pleasure kind of spilling into everything, right? Or more directly, perhaps, for Deleuze and Guattari's argument, right, that desire simply happens, right? Without kind of fetters, in a certain manner of speaking, right? And so this is kind of interesting, because we're seeing like Oedipus here, right? We're not necessarily talking about a superego here, right? But Oedipus does something to reality and desire here, right? And this is kind of how we're going to understand the psychotic and the neurotic in terms of the reality and pleasure principles.
And with that, I think I'll move to the next paragraph. Because it's short one, but sort of dives right into what you're talking about. What interests us is the precise role of the Oedipus complex in this convergence. For if it is true that the familial themes often erupt into a psychotic consciousness, we would be all the more surprised, in line with the remark by Lacan, if Oedipus were in fact discovered in neurosis, where it is supposed to be latent, rather than psychosis, where it is to be held to be patent. But isn't it true instead that in psychosis, the familial complex appears precisely as a stimulus, whose quality is a matter of indifference, a simple inductor not playing the role of organizer, where the intensive investments of reality bear on something totally different, social, historical, or even cultural fields? Oedipus simultaneously invades consciousness and dissolves into itself, testifying to its incapacity to be an organizer. Driving back, I think, a little bit to where you were heading, Jack. A lot of this point is them talking about do these complexes, how do they operate on the unconscious? How do they make things happen? Is the drive coming from the id and the complex is coming out of that? Does the family play into this? How does it work? And again, within Freud, a lot of that is as we're formed over time. The family does a lot of that stuff, and if they don't do a good job of helping us merge properly with reality, we become neurotic or psychotic based on that, and the complexes sort of come with that, including Oedipus, which is a complex we are innately have as humans. It organizes all of these other things. And their point in this paragraph is, no, actually, Oedipus simultaneously invades consciousness and dissolves into itself, which that fact alone testifies to its inability to be this organizer that supposedly is putting all of this together in the first place. Or did that make no sense?
I like where you're going with that, right? Because they're right. But isn't it true instead that in psychosis the familial complex appears precisely as a stimulus whose quality is a matter of indifference? A simple inductor not playing the role of organizer, where the intensive investments of reality bear on something totally different, the social, historical, and cultural fields. Oedipus simultaneously invades consciousness and dissolves into itself, testifying to its incapacity to be a so-called organizer, right? So right here, like the premise that there is this disillusionment from reality through like Oedipus and that, right? That's kind of being thrown away here, right? Because we just saw how the psychotics don't correspond to the Oedipus complex, right? They don't have this familial ancestral engagement with the father and the mother here, right? If anything, it's topsy-turvy. And all you can do is try and reverse that, right? Or argue it is a reversal. And if it's a reversal, you're kind of in trouble if you're going to argue that it's like at the same time, the predicate, right? Because how could it be reversed then? But to make a concluding point, and that's important because then if Oedipus doesn't function as an organizer, right? What does it do?
Well, and I'll just continue the next paragraph because that's literally the first line. Once this is admitted, it is enough to measure psychosis against this fugue. What is this PDF doing? What's the word in the original? Please, anyone? Fugue?
I like fugue, but this fake standard.
Fake. Of course it's fake. Oh my god. Once this is admitted, it is enough to measure psychosis against this fake standard, enough to lead it to a false criterion. Oedipus to obtain the loss of reality effect. This is not an abstract operation. An Oedipal organization is imposed on the psychotic, though for the sole purpose of assigning the lack of this organization in the psychotic in his very body. It is an exercise in naked flesh, in the depths of the soul. The psychotic reacts with autism and with the loss of reality. Could it be the loss of reality is not the effect of the schizophrenic process, but the effect of its forced Oedipalization, that is to say, its interruption? Must we correct what we were saying a little earlier and suppose that some tolerate Oedipalization less well than others? Thus the schizo would not be ill within the Oedipus complex, from an Oedipus arising all the more in his hallucinated consciousness as he lacked it in the symbolic organization of his unconscious? On the contrary, he is ill because of the Oedipalization to which he is made to submit, the most somber organization, and which he can no longer tolerate. He who has gone on a distant journey, as though one were constantly bringing back home the person capable of setting whole continents and cultures adrift. He is not suffering from a divided self or a shattered Oedipus, but on the contrary, from having been brought back to everything he had left. A drop in intensity to the body without organs is 0. Autism. Schizo has no other means of reacting to this, blocking all of the investments of reality, the barriers placed before him by the Oedipal system of social and psychic repression. As Lang says, they are interrupted in their journey. They have lost reality. But when did they lose it? During the journey or during the interruption of the journey? So here they're asking one of the big questions of a lot of this, which they've been hinting at quite a bit. Now they're starting to get at really harsh. The question is, commonly thought in psychoanalytic sort of history, and this is across the board from Freud to Lacan. The idea is you're a psychotic, you're already broken, you're already on a broken journey of schizophrenia, and that is what you need to be helped by. You're already broken. Then the question would be, we bring you back, we heal you, great, we Oedipalize you, yay then. But wait, this is kind of happens hand in hand. So the question is it that the person's already broken, or that they're, as they would say, they're on a journey, and we grab them and we force them into a very specific box, and at that point is when they get broken, but we blame it on the journey. And that's their question they end with here, is during the journey or during the interruption? It's not equals 0. I'm going to go back to that. A drop in intensity of the body without organs equals it's O, Michael?
I think the way I read that, at least, is when they talk earlier in this book and also later in A Thousand Plateaus, they talk about like the 0 intensity body, the body without organs, with its like purely mechanistic automatic responses to things. Like, it's not incapable, but like all the stimulus the body without organs received is reacted to in like a machinic, engineered, automatic function. It has no like intensity in and of itself. So like I that's what I read here when they're talking about a drop in intensity to the body without organs equals 0.
Okay, maybe it's a translation too, but on my book it's definitely an O, like it's round. So.
Well, it may be. I mean, they have a lot of. I do believe their intention here is to mean what Ben said. They may be trying to be clever about it, where the intensity of the body without organs is O, egg 0.
Yeah, it's also the first letter of organ, so maybe it's a pun here.
Yeah,
and also autism sounds like it's starting with an O.
Yeah, the big deal here is the phrase they have here, the whole thing, and it's a thing that they've referenced elsewhere, so I can be fairly confident in, I think, what they're trying to get at, which is that having been brought from everything back to everything he had left, the intensities of the body without organs are earned via the intensities of experience, the actual lived realities and connections that a person has had. A schizo would have that as well. So they would be going out and connecting on their, like, out on a walk, seeing the trees and everything, all of that. But then we pull them back, we say, oh, no, everything you left behind, this other thing, the 0, the before experience, you get to lose all of that intensity, and now you go to this, and that's to them the catatonia. I'm going to start saying catatonia instead of autism, but that's the realm they're playing in here. So it's the schizo has no other means of reacting to this, blocking all of his investments of reality, the barriers placed before him. It's the natural reaction to this is to just drop to 0. Heat death. Heat death is the word I use for it. The lack of intensity at all, no movement, just there.
Reminds me of Superman. But yeah, I think that's pretty much it, because, right, so the question being, what does Oedipus do? Well, maybe it doesn't organize desire, right, especially if it's dissolving in consciousness, right? right? Because it's not the unconscious. So it seems what it does is it affects the schizophrenic processes by kind of damming them. Not in the sense of hell, but damming like a beaver dams, right? So you're seeing desire here kind of reacting to perimeters being established, right?
So I'll continue. Because now we're discussing, again, where the complex enters, where Oedipalization messes with the person. Where do they get the sickness from? Is it from the journey, or is it during the interruption of the journey? Hence, another possible formulation of an inverse relationship. There would be something like two groups, psychotics and neurotics, those who do not tolerate Oedipalization and those who tolerate it and are even content with it and evolve within it. Those on whom the Oedipal imprint does not take and those on whom it does. Quote, I believe my friends cast off in a group at the start of the New Age with forces for a practical explosion that thrust them into the paternalistic deviation that I find depraved. A second group of loners, of which I am a part, doubtless constituted by centers of collarbones, was deprived of any possibility of individual success at the moment they were engaged in laborious studies in innate science. With regard to them, my rebellion against the paternalism of the first group placed me, from the second year, in a socially difficult position that was growing more and more suffocating. So, do you believe these two groups are capable of being joined? I am not too angry with these bastards of virile paternalism. I am not vindictive. In any case, if I have won, there will be no more struggles between the Father and the Son. I am speaking of God's people, naturally, not of those close to Him who take themselves for His people. End quote. It is the recording of desire on the increate body, without organs, and the familial recording on the socius that are in opposition throughout the two groups. The innate science in psychosis and the neurotic experimental sciences, the schizoid eccentric circle and the neurosis triangle. This is a lot here. I shouldn't be I'm streaming the only copy. Someone want to find the footnote? Oh, webcam parrot. Why don't you dive in real quick while I find this footnote?
Well, I just thought it was interesting that in an earlier section, they talked about the Oedipus with respect to a certain way of doing psychoanalysis as the thing that induces but does not do the organization. And this book is largely about organization, with the exception of one thing, which is of course the thing which lacks organs, right? The thing that is not organized, the body without organs. And it almost seems like they're saying that to the psychoanalyst, Oedipus, what they are sort of perhaps unknowingly here calling the body without organs, in that it's like the background, much like the body without organs is the background for all of the intensive properties to occur on, right? The Oedipal is the background by which everything else to the psychoanalyst happens on, and is all coordinates correspond to the Oedipal in some way. And I also think it's interesting that they've started talking about the body without organs again after not talking about it for such a long time. For several sections, they haven't mentioned it at all, and now suddenly they're coming back to it in this section.
And absolutely, that's a really great point, because the timing is, because we're kind of, if we want to look at the last three sections, the BWO and its implications on the first handful of paralogisms, I think is, I don't want to say negligible, but it's not really the point, like the big thing. But here they're definitely going to be getting into that, so that's really fair. It is interesting.
Although I don't know if that's... The question came up a lot of times earlier into the reading where it was like, oh, what's an example of a body without organs? And I don't know if the Oedipus is the best way to answer that question either, but they seem to be implying something like that, at least.
Yeah, there's a they do the structure of a thing that sort of invades and does stuff, sort of a structure that has its own an apparatus. That I think is what's the word they started using? God damn it.
Assemblage?
Assemblage, thank you.
I don't think the body or the organs is an assemblage. It's the opposite of an assemblage, right?
Well, it is, but I mean, the Oedipal complex is is an assemblage.
I think to them it's an assemblage, and to the psychoanalyst it's not.
Yes.
And that's their problem with it.
And it's worth mentioning. So the middle text here, I wanted to confirm what I remembered. So there was a patient at Laborde who actually became a writer and wrote a great deal. The name was Jacques Bess, and this passage is from the Grand. I'm just going to post it so we can have a French person, since we have one here, say it aloud for me, Michael, if you would.
Okay, so you had my internet is cutting a bit. It seems like. Can you hear me?
Yes. Well, maybe not. So it's Jacques Bess, Le Grand Pack.
It's La Grande Pack.
Le Grand Pack. So Jacques Bess is a fairly, I don't want to say prolific author, but has a handful of books that are, and this one we read the last time around because he's mentioned a few times, specifically the earlier sections where they talk about a schizo on a walk, they mentioned Bess very quickly. They mentioned a handful of other authors as well. Bess is interesting because his writings are specifically from his own perspective. He's not writing about another character. It's very semi-audio, autobiographical. And so, as he's going on his walk, this passage here, and as well as the other passages, is very much from his perspective. He was a patient of Guattari's, very specifically. So, obviously, a lot of this has a very specific use and sort of passage for them. So, a very deep connection between them. The passage here, and the reason that it's used as they talk about it, is one second. I want to go back to it. Did I miss it? Oh no. One moment, sorry. Did I miss it? There it is. All right. So the discussion he's having here is about the social connections and groups that he was a part of, and specifically that he joined one group to play off against another, and it had to do with the paternalism of them and bringing in the father. This is his overall sort of stance inside of this, is the way that these things get paternalized and how the relations between the familial recording and the recording of desire sort of play against it. And within these groups, how they sort of are in opposition. Specifically, they do summarize this. I just want to make sure I go over that by saying it is the recording of desire on the increate body without organs and the familial recording of the socius that are in opposition throughout the groups. As he describes them very specifically, the way that the groups operate, their own desires that are being recorded, the things they want to do aren't shit they're doing, because very specifically they are bastards of virile paternalism, which I kind of like as a specific phrase. But it's that is where he's ascribing that, and for him it's a big deal because there's so much they want to do, but it's being sort of, again, we might say triangulated, as they say here, the schizoid eccentric circle being squished into the neurotic triangle. That's how I read this whole part. It's a really interesting piece. I'll copy a summary that I had saved from last time in the chat.
Yeah, and I really like how Webcam here you kicked this off, because you're asking, I think, one of the guiding questions for this chapter, and certainly going into the next chapter, right, which is what makes Oedipus possible, and by extension, what does Oedipus do, right? So we've seen the three paralogisms, right, and how they play into Oedipus. We've now seen the fourth paralogism of displacement, right? And we've seen Oedipus in relation to all that. And now we're seeing Oedipus in a relationship of the body without organs, right, and the socius, right? And this is kind of interesting because now we're focusing more directly, even though we haven't gotten too deep into the socius in this book yet, on how Oedipus relates to the two, right?
Did you want to expand at all, webcam?
Sorry, I was a little distracted there.
No worries. All right, I'll continue to the next part. On a more general level, it is the two kinds of use made of synthesis that are in opposition. On the one hand, there are the desiring machines, and on the other, the Oedipal narcissistic machine. In order to understand the details of the struggle, it must be borne in mind that the family relentlessly operates on desiring production, inscribing itself into the recording process of desire. Clutching at everything, the family performs a vast appropriation of the productive forces. It displaces and reorganizes in its own fashion the entirety of the connection and the hiatuses that characterize the machines of desire. It reorganizes them all along the lines of the universal castration that conditions the family itself. Quote, "A dead rat stats," said our toad, suspended from the ceiling of the sky. But it also redistributes these breaks in accordance with its own laws and the requirements of social production. The inscription performed by the family follows the pattern of its triangle by distinguishing what belongs to the family from what does not. It also cuts inwardly along the lines of differentiation that form global persons. There's daddy, there's mommy, there you are, and then there's your sister. Cut into the flow of milk here, it's your brother's turn. Don't shit here, don't take a crap here. Cut into the stream of shit over there. The tension is the primary function of the family. It is a matter of learning what elements of desiring production the family is going to reject, what it is going to retain, what it is going to direct along the dead-end roads leading to its own undifferentiated, the miasma, and what on the contrary is going to lead down the paths of a contagious and reproducible differentiation. For the family creates, at the same time, its disgraces and its honors, the non-differentiation of its neurosis and the differentiation of its ideal, which are distinguishable only in appearance. I stumbled on that one because I had to tell my son not to take a shit in the place. So that's the thing I've done. So there you go. I'm the bastard, apparently. That's the thing. I can only assume that this is just how families operate, like no matter what sort of time frame, at least within nuclear family capital. But man, it was just like I was reading, and I was like, fuck, I had to tell Dexter that.
Oh, I think you're onto something about like this just being like the general operation of families. Even if you go back to like Buddhism and Confucianism and like old Chinese philosophy, like the whole point is to use like the family and like the family social status as a repression mechanism for people's behavior.
But it's the big deal here is sort of the second line of this, which is on the one hand there's desiring machines, on the other the Oedipal narcissistic machine. The Oedipal narcissistic machine is the family ensuring it's a family. It is a thing that creates itself, continues to push itself. That once it's created, once it's a thought, once it's part of how things are organized, it does what it can to keep that thing going. And it's again kind of the way that works. Retention is the primary function of the family. It is a matter of learning what elements of desiring production the family is going to reject, what it is going to retain, what it is going to direct along the dead-end roads leading to its own undifferentiated, and what, on the contrary, it is going to lead down the paths of a contagious and reproducible differentiation. That is essentially how the assemblage works. That's what assemblages do. That's it. This is the early part of assemblage, basically. Families reject something, they allow others, they encourage other behaviors and incentivize their own replication and continuation, just like when I told Dexter not to shit where he shit, or when your son looks up and he goes, "I'm a cat," and that's a problem, by the way. Just if you ever have kids, don't your kid ever does that, and he's 2.5, he's taking a shit somewhere. But these things sort of just become, are you being a good enough parent? Are you being the right dad? Are you placing the right restrictions on him? And the societal pressure on you as a parent to do that is difficult in and of itself. But again, this is their conversation they're having, is the syntheses are in opposition. Dexter's desiring machines are doing what they're doing, and they're always going to do what they do. My job role inside of a family, and my wife's, is to sculpt him into a person who can survive within society well. And you'll hear people say this a lot. My job is to make sure I'm preparing my child for the world. This is even the nicest, kindest parents. That's how they talk about it. And this is how you do that. Prepare them for the world. And what it means is to properly mold them into something that's allowed to function inside of how society works. At least that's how I read this. And I know I'm probably taking it overtly personally, because that's the way that goes, but hey.
Well, I mean, that's it, though, is this opposition between the socius and the body without organs, or more directly between the familial and the just the unconscious, right? So, like we said, right, we've got desiring machines being affected by the Oedipal, right? So we've got like the schizoid process encountering what I'm calling damnation, right? But just just barriers, right? And I don't want to say dissociation, but breaks with social investments, right? Or breaks with desiring investments, yeah. And at the same time, you've got these something going on with Oedipus or the familial here, right? Which is in part performing segregative uses, right? Like this is kind of getting into the exclusive disjunction or the second paralogism, right? Where we're starting to see this either or affecting desire.
Yeah, and I'm just going to continue because it continues on from there. The family's working. Brooks, the dad, is doing his thing. The question is, what's Dexter's desiring machines doing? So, while this is taking place, what is desiring production doing? The retained elements do not enter into the new use of synthesis that imposes such a profound change on them without causing the whole triangle to reverberate. The desiring machines are at the door. They make everything shake when they enter. Moreover, what does not enter causes perhaps even more vibrations to be felt. The desiring machines reintroduce or attempt to reintroduce their deviant cuts and breaks. The child feels the task required of him. But what is to be put into the triangle? How are the selections to be made? The father's nose or the mother's ear, will that do? Can that be retained? Will that constitute a good Oedipal incision? And the bicycle horn? What is part of the family? It is the triangle's job to vibrate, to resonate under the pressure of what it retains as much as what it thrusts aside. Resonance, here again either muffled or public, disgraceful or proud, is the family's second function. Family is at the same time an anus that retains, a voice that resounds, and a mouth that consumes. Its very own three syntheses, since it is a matter of connecting desire to the ready-made objects of social production. Go buy Madeleines and Combray if you really want to feel the vibrations. I don't have the slightest clue what the fuck that means.
Proust.
It's Proust. Of course it's fucking Proust.
Proust.
I mean, that's like the most famous part of Proust, the episode
Proust
of the Madeleine. Yeah.
I'm in the middle of rereading. Shut up. Please, if someone wants to explain the moment. The Proustian reference. Not all of us have an instant read and understand the moment. That's the most famous, so please, come on.
Okay, so Proust is writing in Swan's Way in the first chapter. Cambrai, the narrator, eats this cookie. It's called a madeleine. A cookie is maybe not the right word. Biscuit. And
It's more of a cake. It's
cake. Yeah, cake is
cakey.
the
They're
right word.
cakey.
Yeah. It's just like and it's soaked with a type of like tea that infuses it with a certain flavor, and it all of a sudden calls up a memory that he's not considered basically in years, and it floods back in like perfect memory, him eating this madeleine as a child, his aunt dipping it in like a special medicinal tea and giving it to him in her house that his family would spend the summers in Cambrai in France, and then the like whole city in its like essence comes back to him in his memory, and it like exists as vibrant as it ever did. And it's like this really well written linguistically vibrant section of Swan's Way that is referenced in a lot of other media.
So then, is this reference here is pointing towards the fact that the vibrations are all around it. The triangle's job is essentially to vibrate, to resonate, and he is basically going through this hyper nostalgic sort of, here I may have desiring machines, but here is how they're formed, and these ready-made objects of social production are sitting there waiting for him. Is that the intention there?
Kind of. I think when they say like the family is at the same time an anus that retains, a voice that resounds, and a mouth that consumes, his very own three syntheses, since it is a matter of connecting desire to the ready-made objects of social production. Go buy madeleines in Cambrai if you really want to feel the vibrations, right? So there's something happening here where desiring production is getting linked with social production, right? And that in of itself gives us three syntheses, right? Or we're seeing three syntheses used to do this connector work.
Yeah, I think the whole there's like the main project in Search of Lost Time is sort of like the delineation and definition and sort of experience of time and losing time and wasting time and regaining time and finding time in its essence. But a secondary project throughout the series of novels is like sort of how do these social elements and processes and aspects interplay with each other to create people's personal lives. There's the Dreyfus affair, which rocks through France and divides communities and establishes new alliances along social lines against family lines, and World War I. And so like I think so like Cambrai, the city itself is a ready-made social object full of other ready-made social interactions, is also kind of like a point he might be making.
That makes sense. I like that.
And to your point about resonance, bro, it's like we're getting at the point of like, why does it resonate, right? You know, what causes the or what are the conditions for this this familial triangle to do this resonation, right? And part of that seems to be this this selective process, right? Because we have to understand here too. Let me see here. Desiring machines reintroduce or attempt to reintroduce their deviant cuts and breaks. But what is to be put into the triangle? How are the selections made? What is part of the family? It is the triangle's job to vibrate, to resonate under the pressure of what? it retains as much as what it thrusts aside. So this point about resonance, right? There have to be exclusions here for this resonance to, or rather there have to be exclusions and inclusions in the triangle for the resonance to take place, it seems to me. Right, so we're talking about these linkages, and with that we're talking about how the familial does do this retention, right, this kind of holding within the triangle, but it also pushes things outside of the triangle, right? Or that is to say, the demarcation comes with things outside that triangle, like we saw with the social investments earlier. Or I shouldn't say the desiring investments earlier.
All right. I'm going to move on to the next part. We now come to the realization that the simple opposition between these two groups is inadequate. An opposition that would allow one to define neurosis as an intra-Oedipal disorder and psychosis as an extra-Oedipal escape. It is not even enough to state that the two groups are capable of being joined. Rather, it is the possibility of discriminating directly between the two that creates difficulty. How can we distinguish between the pressure that familial reproduction exercises on desiring production and the pressure that desiring production exercises on familial reproduction? The Oedipal triangle vibrates and trembles, but is this in terms of the hold over the machines of desire that it constantly guarantees itself, or in terms of these machines that escape the Oedipal imprint and cause the triangle to release its grip? Where does the resonance of the triangle reach its limit? Familial romance expresses an effort to save the Oedipal genealogy, but it also expresses a free thrust of non-Oedipal genealogy. Fantasies are never pregnant forms, but border on frontier phenomena ready to cross over to one side or the other. In short, Oedipus is strictly undecidable. It can be found everywhere all the more readily for being undecidable, and in this sense, it is correct to say that Oedipus is strictly good for nothing. It's a lot there. The thing that's interesting here, I'm going to try to take a crack at this because there's a lot said here, and it's one of the paragraphs I definitely have trouble with because it sounds like to me that they're saying essentially because there's no way for us to say whether or not desiring machines actually produce Oedipus, or if the familial reproduction pushes down and creates Oedipus within desire, that standoff, and there's no way to sort of ever solve that, naturally makes Oedipus sort of this thing that becomes quickly undecidable. That because we can't say where it starts, Oedipus isn't necessarily good for anything. It doesn't allow us to say, oh, it's definitely not something here, but it's also definitely not a thing here. It's like, then who cares? Is kind of what they're saying. Am I wrong with that?
I mean, maybe that's the way in which they're critical of it, right? Because they're okay with other things like that. But I think to the extent that they're critical is that it's treated like it is that way, but it's actually the other way. As in, some would like to think that it doesn't make a statement on whether something is good or bad, but then is frequently used as such.
Oh, I like that actually. It's describing sort of an ethics to Oedipus is their problem with it, saying, oh, it's good or bad, or we need to eliminate it, or we need to do that. Like, no, it's a complex, sure, but to say it's created in one place or another, we have no way of knowing. So let's set it aside and talk more about the things that actually create such things, or could create such things, or be involved in that. and sort of sidestepping it entirely.
Yeah, because I don't think they necessarily have a problem with Oedipus just existing, right? It's the application of Oedipus in a specific way that's very common,
of course, yes.
that they're being critical of.
Yes, absolutely. It may be called Anti-Oedipus, but they're actually not against Oedipus as a thing. They're against Oedipus as a determinate thing, and the structure that we've given it and the power we've given it within how it forms us.
Maybe anti-Oedipalization would be a better title.
Yeah, anti-Oedipalization is probably a better one for sure. Ken, can you say why you disagree with fantasy not being pregnant? Maybe give for those of us who maybe didn't see much issue there. How do you interpret the phrase "fantasies are never pregnant forms"? Put order on frontier phenomena. All right, cool. Well, we'll give you a second to get in the other room. Does anyone have any questions so far? I think it was a good spot. We'll take a second as Ken's moving over. Does anyone here have questions, thoughts, issues about what's happening or who's talking here or anything that's being said? Like, now's the time. Let's do it.
So, I suppose you can hear me all right. Well, I mean, the first thing, Oedipus is makes being in existence all one thing, and that's the failure not to be. So, under the guise of Oedipus and psychoanalysis, and this is like going back to Freud's idea of, like, specific idea of the death drive being the return to in organic state or whatever, that being is a fundamental failure of non-being. And I don't know, that's sort of a difficult thing to introject and work with. So that's one thing. But the thing on fantasy not being pregnant, maybe I'm just not reading it right, but I mean, you can have autopoetic fantasies, you know, and they don't initially have any sort of meaning per se until someone tells you what it means, and then that's a problem because that quashes desiring production. But maybe I misread it, but I sort of want to hold on to fantasy being an important aspect of desiring production, I guess. But maybe they just mean specifically the Oedipal fantasy, you know, maybe not all fantasy.
But it's interesting here because they're calling fantasies phenomena, so it sounds, to me, this sounds like we're talking about the conscious here, or at least the pre-conscious maybe, but it sounds like part of Oedipus is that fantasies, because Oedipus is, so like this is kind of what we were getting at with like the anti-Oedipalization versus anti-Oedipus, right? The trouble with the neurotic and the psychotic, right, is it's not that we can define one as intra-Oedipal and the other as extra-Oedipal escape, right? So you can't just be psychotic and out of us. It's not enough to say that two groups are capable of being joined. Sorry, that you can be neurotic and psychotic. Rather, it is the possibility of discriminating directly between the two that creates the difficulty, right? So they're kind of conflating, it seems to me. And this seems to be the point about Oedipus being strictly undecidable, is that, you know, whether you're neurotic or psychotic here, there seems to be a kind of Oedipal condition for that, right? Because Oedipus seems to be, you know, we talked in the beginning about like how the reality and pleasure principle at stake, and Oedipus seems to be kind of working with those two here. And so I guess like fantasy, what's happening to it is in relation to this Oedipal sort of confluence, right? Fantasy seems to be something happening at like at least pre-conscious or conscious level, right? So it's not something that the unconscious seems to be producing here directly. It seems to be something that is pushing into consciousness. and therefore, right, like Oedipus is, as we conclude here, right, Oedipus is good for nothing here. So any pregnancy wouldn't, what are you going to do with that in terms of Oedipus, right? It doesn't pregnate anything.
Yeah, I would want to de-Oedipalize fantasy there first, because to make it more coherent, the psychoanalytic view is the idea that, and I think maybe Freud said this somewhere, maybe not, that it's sort of like the way a crystal lattice breaks. Like the whole idea is that subjectivity is caused by failure, and a crystal lattice breaks along typical lines. And for psychoanalysis, those three lines are the neurotic, the psychotic, and the perverse, and each three have a specific relationship to whatever psychoanalytic structures. So I guess I won't go into them, but I mean, that's already a problem, right? Because already right there, you're reducing all of contingently being a subject into three modes. And so you can only have three types and that just seems like empirically wrong.
Well, I think their use of fantasy throughout, just as a quick mention, I think might be a thing worth having a secondary discussion on. They have the line in here where they say that dream and fantasy are to myth and tragedy as private property is to public property, which seems to be more sort of indicating they all are essentially the same thing, but we've separated and siphoned off specific parts by choice rather than by function. And that kind of is how they get into a great deal of this, and their major critique of psychoanalysis is sort of about playing with that and how the representations that they discover inside of this universal libido or whatever, like, get reanimated and made subjective to extend mythic and tragic contents to infinity. That's a quote from later on in the book. So I think when we talk about their use of fantasy or dream or myth or all of these things that are these large-scale representations, I think their usage is very different than what we might traditionally be using for it.
Yeah, so like Lewis Carroll, for example, in Alice, right? There's all sorts of weird ways to go. You aren't funneled into three ways of being produced as a subject, like insofar as the unconscious produces subjectivity. And also I think another thing is that fantasy is rarely a private affair. Like it may seem private because you might not speak about it, but I think fantasies are always, not always, well, yeah, why not, always collective.
Yeah, no, and I mean they specifically state that so again, I think it's a question of how we're using this. So to them, desiring production doesn't create fantasies. It's not how it works. Desiring production is just producing shit over and over and over. And then as a result of social organization, social repression, and the overproduction or underproduction or anti-production or, the complexities around that, does someone create fantasy as a sort of parallel world of gratification? The term they use is imaginary compensation, sort of for that lack. So it's a very specific use of fantasy, and for that, it does, like, that usage is my understanding of how they sort of use it without. And so because of that, like, yeah, fantasies are themselves not pregnant forms. They're frontier phenomena ready to cross from one side. They themselves are not necessarily pregnant forms. Like desire doesn't create fantasies.
This would be worth going back into chapter 2, section 2, where they go into fantasy a little bit more directly there. For instance, they write, and this is page 63 in the Penguin. In this respect, Klosowski has convincingly shown the inverse relationship that pulls the fantasy in two directions, as the economic law establishes perversions in the so-called psychic exchanges, or as the psychic exchanges, on the contrary, promote a subversion of the law. They go on, the two kinds of fantasy, or rather the two regimes, are therefore distinguished according to whether the social production of so-called goods imposes its rule on desire through the intermediary of an ego, whose fictional unity is guaranteed by the goods themselves, or whether the desiring production of affects imposes its rule on institutions whose elements are no longer anything but drives. So the point being that there is a little bit more discussion of fantasy, and I even see a little bit on repression going on. Around pages 62, maybe 64 in chapter 2, section 2. I forgot to mention earlier, for more on autism, chapter 1, section 4 goes into that, and their engagement with autism as part of schizophrenia more directly.
But I think we'll have to have this discussion because I think we're using fantasy differently, and it's worth us having this chat for sure because I want to make sure I'm understanding it. For sure, I want to make sure I'm understanding the proper usage of this within like their class. So let's kind of put a pin in it for a little bit and continue to the next paragraph. Is that okay?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
Cool. Does anyone have any other questions, though, about this paragraph? All right. Let us turn to the beautiful story of Gerard de Nerval. He wants Aurélie, his fondest love, to be the same as Adrienne, the little girl of his childhood. He perceives them as identical, and Aurélie and Adrienne, both in one, are his mother. Will it be said that the identification as a perceptual identity is here a sign of psychosis? One that encounters the criterion of reality. The complex invades the psychotic consciousness only at the price of a rupture with the real, whereas in neurosis, the identity remains that of the unconscious representations and does not compromise perception. But what is there to gain from inscribing everything on Oedipus, even psychosis? One step further into Aurélie, Adrienne, and the mother are the virgin. Nerval seeks the point where the vibration of the triangle is at its limit. Quote, "You are simply seeking for a dream," says Aurélie. Everything is not inscribed in Oedipus without everything at its extreme, fleeing beyond the reach of Oedipus. These identifications were not identifications with persons from the viewpoint of perception, but identifications of names with regions of intensity that provide the impetus toward other, still more intense regions, stimuli of one sort or another that set in motion another journey altogether, stases that prepare for other breakthroughs, other movements, where the mother is no longer encountered but the Virgin and God. And twice I have crossed and conquered the Acheron. Thus, the schizo will accept the reduction of everything to the mother, since it is of no importance whatsoever. He is sure to be able to make everything rise again from the mother, and to keep for his own secret use all the virgins that had been placed there. Oh no, what's the real translation, Michael? Is it the and twice I have
No,
crossed?
so yeah, it's just El Desdicado. He says in El Desdicado, he says I have crossed 3 times the Acheron.
Well, that's different than twice.
So I'm confused at why they translated 3 times in twice. Maybe it's number of feet in the poetry in English. Maybe I don't know.
That's whatever. That's weird. That's a weird one. French numbers are tricky. I mean, 1, 2, 3, you never know. I mean, fuck, I'm already lost. So, this is essentially continuing the same argument they're utilizing Gerard de Nerval as his story as an explanation of this, and breaking it down even further to continue talking about what we get from Oedipus in this situation. Is it this or is it that? And ultimately, they're all the Virgin Mary. Are they all God? And they all come down to those archetypes ultimately, and everything can be squished into that because, as they say, the schizo will accept the reduction of everything to the mother, since it's of no importance. He's sure of being able to make everything rise again from the mother, and to keep for his own secret use all the virgins that had been placed there, all the things that he had connected get put there, and he's able to pull them back. Sure, he's able to go in. They continue this. I actually think I'm just going to dive for the next paragraph, unless there's a comment on this one, because it continues the same line of thought very, very quickly. All right. Everything can be converted into neurosis or warped out of shape into psychosis. It is therefore not in this fashion that the question must be posed. It would be inaccurate to maintain an Oedipal interpretation for the neuroses and to reserve an extra Oedipal explanation for the psychoses. These are not two groups. There is no difference in nature between neuroses and psychoses, for in any case, desiring production is the cause. The ultimate cause of both the psychotic subversions that shatter Oedipus or overwhelm it, and of the neurotic reverberations that constitute it. Such a principle takes on its full meaning if it is related to the problem of actual factors. One of the most important points of psychoanalysis was the evaluation of the role of these actual factors. Even in neurosis, insofar as they are distinguishable from the familial infantile factors, all the major dissensions were linked to this evaluation. The difficulties bore on several aspects. First, the nature of these factors. Were they somatic, social, metaphysical? Were they the famous problem of living, through which a very pure desexualized idealism was reintroduced into psychoanalysis? In the second place, the modality of these factors. Did they act in a negative, privative fashion by mere frustration? Finally, their moment, their own time. Was it not self-evident that the actual factor arose afterward, and signified recent in opposition to the infantile, or the oldest factor that could be sufficiently explained by the familial complex? Even a writer like Reich, so careful to situate desire in relation to the forms of social production, demonstrating thereby that there is no psychoneuroses that is not also an actual neuroses, continues to present the actual factors as acting by means of a repressive deprivation, the sexual stasis, and as arising afterward, which leads him to maintain a kind of diffuse Oedipalism, since the stasis or the actual privative factor only defines the energy of the neurosis, not the content, that for its own part refers to the infantile Oedipal conflict, this old conflict becoming reactivated by the actual stasis. To read the Reich footnote. All neurotic fantasies can be traced back to the child's early sexual relationship to the parents. However, if it were not continually nourished by the contemporary stasis of excitation which it initially produced, the child-parent conflict could not, by itself, cause a permanent disturbance of the psychic equilibrium. Oh, someone want to break this down? Let me get some water. It's a lot.
Well, I mean, in a nutshell, right, we talked about how, like, there's this kind of problem with the neurotic and the psychotic are sort of conflating, right? It's hard to differentiate them. And so it seems like in either case, right, Oedipus is the point of departure and arrival for them, right?
Could you repeat, please? I think I phased out.
Sure. It seems like part of the thing with, like we said earlier, right, the problem with the neurotic and the psychotic is how do you kind of differentiate the two, right? Because they seem to they seem to, if not be conflationary, at least have a confluence, right? And so let's say the suggestion is that there are not two groups, there is no difference in nature between neurosis and psychoses, for in any case, desiring production is the cause, the ultimate cause of both the psychotic subversions that shatter Oedipus or overwhelm it, and of the neurotic reverberations that constitute it. It's like, at one level, it seems like Oedipus is kind of, for psychoanalysis, the point of departure and arrival for the two groups. But let's say Deleuze and Guattari are going even further, right, to say, but more kind of directly, right? Desiring production is the cause, the ultimate cause of both the psychotic subversions that shatter Oedipus or overwhelm it in either of those points, and of the neurotic reverberations that constitute it.
I mean, and that's the huge difference that I've been seeing between. Oh, can y'all hear me? I just realized my mic is closed off.
Yes.
You can use cool. Between what Deleuze and Guattari are doing in psychoanalysis is desire. Like, that is the gulf of difference between the two, because desire is not, the Prius or whatever, the prime mover or whatever in the oceanic gulf. For psychoanalysis, you start with need that can't be articulated. So an infant cries just because it has unpleasant sensations or something, but it doesn't even necessarily have a knowledge of why it's crying is the idea. And only does and then the meaning of its cries get impinged on it. So the parental figures feed it whenever it cries, and then over time through repetition it's like, oh, I'm crying because I'm hungry. And then you get demand, which is the articulation of this unarticulatable need that's just, I guess it would stand in the same place as intensity. But the problem with that is that it's impossible, because there is no meaning to the need per se. And then you get desire as a way out of the impossibility of demand, which still has its own impossibility, but in desire you now can have equivocity. Like, in desire, what I say can mean more than what a person thinks my words mean. And so then you can get the chain of signification moving and metonymy and whatnot. But for Deleuze and Guattari, desire is this, like, it's almost like a cosmic principle of sorts. And Oedipus, for Freud at least, and Lacan in the beginning, Oedipus is the beginning and the end. So even in psychosis, sometimes Lacan later moves away from this, but the idea is that you try to turn the psychotic structure into a neurotic structure by reintroducing Oedipus and laws and the symbolic. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it, because if the neurotic and the psychotic, right, are ways of talking about desire, which we saw in the beginning they are, because we're talking about the id and the pleasure principle, right? So we're talking about desire, and we're talking about Oedipus then as this kind of point of departure and arrival there, right? Well, what happened to desire, right? Because desire seems to be the fundamental thing here. And so, to your point, right, is it a question of, is it this question of this reverberation and the triangle on that, right, and creating the conditions for this triangulation for there to be desire? Or isn't desire already happening without any of this, right? And therefore, when these structures interact with desire, whether it's neurotic or psychotic, as we're seeing, doesn't desire, since it's already there, do something to them, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think insofar as we're born into some sort of nuclear family type culture, your desire gets Oedipalized to a certain extent. That triangulation is there, but I think that it's an obvious notion that adolescents then try to get outside of the daddy, mommy, me, in rebellion, and the psychoanalytic practice actually isn't so bad because they're really against this kind of interpretation that attributes a single meaning to the so-called analysand's words. Like, they want their interpretation to be ambiguous, so any number of directions can be taken. But then the next move is to bring them right back into that triangulation, to say that, like, all their whatever fantasies, in this way of speaking, reverberate back to daddy, mommy, me, and that all your troubles have to do with childhood memories that Freud ends up saying might not exist in the first place. So little column A, little column B, it sounds like it's hard to not start in Oedipus, insofar as that's how our culture, society, whatever, is structured. But to be able to get out of Oedipus, I think, is, I don't want to say a natural thing, but it seems to be attempted everywhere. But only insofar as we become, tamed so-called animals, that we get brought back into Oedipus. And the funny thing about that is that, this symbolic order thing actually makes you more aggressive and more all of these other things. So it doesn't actually tame you. It makes you enjoy more, and it produces almost the perfect capitalist subject in that way.
Love it. All right. I'm now going to move to the next paragraph. Good combo. I just want to make sure we keep moving. But the Oedipalists are not saying anything different from this when they remark that an actual deprivation or frustration cannot be experienced except in the midst of an older internal qualitative conflict, which blocks not merely the roads prohibited by reality, but also those that reality leaves open, and that the ego forbids itself in its turn, the double impasse formula. Quote, could one find examples illustrating the diagram of actual neuroses in the prisoner, or the concentration camp victim, or the worker harassed by work? It is not certain that they would furnish a large quota. Our systematic tendency is not to accept the evident iniquities of reality without taking stock of them, without trying to disclose in what sense the disorder of the world is manifested in, the subjective disorder, even if it is, with the passing of time, inscribed within more or less irreversible structures. End quote. We understand this sentence, but can't help finding its tone disturbing. The following choice is imposed upon us. Either the actual factor is conceived in a totally exterior privative fashion, which is an impossibility, or it descends into an internal qualitative conflict that is necessarily understood in relation to Oedipus. Oedipus, the fountainhead, where the psychoanalyst washes his hands of the world's iniquities. I'm just going to continue because that was a really clean paragraph. In an altogether different direction, if we consider the idealist deviations of psychoanalysis, we see in them an interesting attempt at giving the actual factors a status other than ulterior or privative. This came about as two concerns were found to be linking in an apparent paradox. For example, in Jung, the concern for curtailing the interminable cure by addressing oneself to the present or actual state of the disorder, and the concern for going back further than Oedipus, even further than the pre-Oedipal, for going much further back, as if what was most actual was also the most primary, the shortest, the furthest removed. Jung presents his archetypes as actual factors that extend in fact beyond the familial images and the transference, as well as being archaic factors, infinitely older and from an order of time which is not that of the infantile factors themselves. But nothing has been gained thereby, since the actual factor ceases to be privative only provided it enjoys the rights of the ideal, and does not cease to be an afterward, except by becoming a beyond, which must be signified anagogically by Oedipus, instead of depending on it analytically. This necessarily results in the reintroduction of the afterward in the temporal difference, as the astonishing distribution proposed by Jung attests. For the young, whose problems concern the family and love, Freud's method, and for those less young, whose problems have to do with social adaptation, Adler, and Jung for the adults and the old people whose problems have to do with the ideal. And we have seen what remains common to Freud and Jung. The unconscious was always measured against myths, and not against the units of production, although the measuring is done in two contrary directions. But what does it matter, after all, if morality or religion find an analytical and regressive meaning in Oedipus, or if Oedipus finds an anagogical or prospective meaning in morality and religion?
Real quick, because I know Ken's going to want the citation there. That what they're referring to is Carl Jung's Contributions to Analytical Psychology, 1948, chapters 1 through 4, and page 345. So chapters 1 through 4 plus one standalone page.
Yeah, I mean, I know where that's from. So that's from his Stages of Life in Volume 8 essay, and then the first couple essays into Volume 7. And it's, I mean, they're decent critiques, you know. His Stages, I actually really just don't like his Stages of Life essay at all, and I don't agree with him on how he sees that, you know, first half of life this, second half of life this. It sounds like nonsense to me. And then so what Jung was trying to do in Volume 7 was to sort of mix together Freud and Adler. So he was working with both the will to power and the Eros principle. That's what he was doing there. The ideal thing is a little is a little misrepresenting, though, because, I mean, if the archetype is an ideal, then, you know, it would be the full scale of the spectrum. So you'd have to include like every quality of a certain in this case mythological motif. So for the wise old man, you'd also have to, not only wisdom, but you'd also have to include like crotchetiness and being a man who abuses his power and sort of manipulates his students and stuff like that. So I don't know how ideal the archetype actually is. And even then, that's the archetypal image. So he draws a difference between this irrepresentable psychoid sphere and then the archetype as such. And the psychoid archetype actually reminds me of the body without organs. But I'll leave that there.
I think by the capital I idea, they're trying to say like there's like the capital A archetype versus the archetype. So like the suggestion would be that like there's an archetype that's maybe it's like a form, or perhaps it's like a noumena here, and then there's like the archetypes that are just kind of sort of emanated from that.
Yeah, so like a really terrible one is like the creation of Joseph Campbell, right? With his hero, how every story is the hero myth, and then he sort of idolizes that. Jung doesn't do that. That's garbage. Jung suggests that insofar as you mime the hero, you're becoming a flat collective figure, and you're going to be sacrificed at some point. So I don't hate Campbell, but he did some damage.
Did you guys hear that? Did you hear that, Brooks?
No, what?
Shh. Star Wars.
Dude, no one mentioned Star Wars. Like, I didn't hear that at all, and I'm just going to continue. I'm not a fan of the Campbell. It's a long story. It's fine. We're moving past Star Wars. God damn it, Jack. To the next paragraph. We maintain the cause of the disorder, neurosis or psychosis, is always in desiring production, in its relation to social production in their different or conflicting regimes, and the modes of investment that desiring production performs in the system of social production. The actual factor is desiring production, insofar as it is caught up in this relationship, this conflict, and these modalities. Nor is this factor either ulterior or privative. Being constitutive of the full life of desire, it is contemporary with the most tender age, and it accompanies this life with every step. It does not arise after Oedipus. It is in no way presupposes an Oedipal organization, nor a pre-Oedipal organization. On the contrary, it is Oedipus that depends on desiring production, either as stimulus of one form or another, a simple inductor through which the anedipal organization of desiring production is formed, beginning with early childhood, or as an effect of the psychic and social repression imposed on desiring production by social reproduction by means of the family. The term actual is not used because it designates what is most recent, but because it would be opposed to former or infantile. It is used in terms of its difference with respect to virtual. And it is the Oedipus complex that is virtual, either inasmuch as it must be actualized in a neurotic formation as a derived effect of the actual factor, or inasmuch as it is dismembered and dissolved in a psychotic formation as the direct effect of this same factor. It is indeed in this sense that the idea of the afterwards seemed to us to be a final paralogism in psychoanalytic theory and practice. Active, desiring production, in its very process, invests from the beginning a constellation of somatic, social, and metaphysical relations that do not follow after Oedipal psychological relations, but that on the contrary will be applied to the underlying Oedipal constellation defined by reaction, or else will exclude this constellation from the field of investment constituting their activity. Undecidable, virtual, reactive, or reactional, such is Oedipus. It is only a reactional formation that results from a reaction to desiring production. It is a serious mistake to consider this formation in isolation, abstractly, independently of the actual factor that coexists with it and to which it reacts. A lot of
Real quick,
in this one.
real quick, Mikkel, you're streaming your video.
You can just hit stop sharing. There's a lot of italics in this sentence, but I'm going to go ahead and say that it's worth continuing. I'm going to reread the middle one, which I think is the most important. but I'll wait for Michael to get right back. I feel bad. He hit a button he probably shouldn't have.
We can honor him by writing songs about this.
Well, I'll dive in. There, he's back. This middle one I want to reread. It is Oedipus that depends on desiring production, either as stimulus of one form or another, a simple inductor through which the anatomical organization of desiring production is formed, beginning with early childhood, or as an effect of the psychic and social repression imposed on desiring production by social reproduction by means of the family. Okay. If we jump back and we start going back to all we've talked about with desiring production and how it forms and how it works through the syntheses and how it's produced and how it operates, all of that stuff that's happening, the connections and disconnections, the desiring machines, everything that's going on, all the desire that's being produced, Oedipus depends on that to be created. Oedipus doesn't exist prior to that. The material that creates Oedipus, the stuff that makes Oedipus a thing, which we'll get into in a second because there's a whole fight we're about to have about virtual and actual. I know we've done it before. Just stay here with this part. Desiring production basically creates all of that. Now, it's either that it stimulates, it's the inductor through which the anatomical organization of desiring production is formed, which happens with early childhood, or it's an effect of the social and psychic repression imposed on desiring production by the social reproduction by means of the family. The difference in regimes, the larger, giant social regime, the molar, and the family, and all of that, it pushing down on desiring machines. That's the other way it gets formed. This central thing, if there's and I know why it's in italics, this is the part that matters to really begin to understand, and because a lot of this and the functionality of how Oedipus is created and stimulated and all of that is in chapter 3 going to be coming front and center. So if you're having trouble understanding this, please, now would be the time to start asking them questions, for sure. So I'll leave questions. We'll talk about that section. We'll get to the second part in a second, which is a whole thing. But this first part, everyone good there? I mean, I'm going to assume that means everyone grasps everything. But again, it's the utilization of family as that repression. Oedipus is either stimulated from beneath, because it plays inside of the psyche by desiring production that kind of forms around it and produces it beginning with early childhood, or as an effect of the psychic and social repression imposed upon it by the social reproduction of the molar side of the desiring regimes, the social side of things, through the family, as they've talked about at this point. They use the term actual here. The actual factor is desiring production. Oh, God. Do I even want to start down this road? I want to get through this rest of this chapter today.
Let's just keep it in the confines of this, though, because if I follow this, what they're basically trying to argue is like, so if you take Oedipus to be point of departure and arrival, then, well, of course, desire is going to begin and end with Oedipus, right? Or, and this is how I think the retrospection works, right? Because so that's what it was. Well, it had to be Oedipus, right? Because that's where, like, okay, reality and pleasure principle, so it's going to start and move toward Oedipus, right? But it sounds like more fundamentally, right, desiring production is the condition for all of that, right? And so that moving forward doesn't necessarily rely on Oedipus, but instead Oedipus needs that in order to either be actualized or in order to do like what I'm calling like a damning. Because you're right. Last time we had like I think it was like a 30-minute discussion on the virtual, the actual, and the real.
Yeah, it's a. We'll skip that whole fight because that ended up taking up far too long. But it was like 2 weeks. It was stupid. Look, the last sentence, the last two sentences are kind of the really important gist and thrust of that whole thing he's talking about there. Oedipus is only a reactional formation, a formation that results from a reaction to desiring production. Again, the formation previously, commonly in psychoanalytic thought, even Lacanian thought, it is not a reactional formation. It is a prescriptive formation. It's there. It is a thing. It is itself its own formation, and things form within it or react with it. They are being very clear here. This is a reactional formation. Desiring production makes it, stimulates it, and sets it up, or social factors come in and pressure from the top to create it. It reacts. It is not actually the thing that desiring production is made of, or the natural shape of it. As they say, they continue. It is a serious mistake to consider this formation in isolation, abstractly independently of the actual factor that coexists with it and to which it reacts. Which is also, that is a bit of a, and Ken's in here, you can tell me if I'm wrong, that's a poke at Lacan for sure, because he does very much sort of do that. And a lot of people have done this, where they pull the Oedipalization as a concept sort of out of things and talk about it in a vacuum. And that is the thing they're talking about, that you're now describing the thing without the things that make it up or stimulate it or create it. And at that moment, like this is representation. We're going to get into that a lot more as we continue on, but this is the challenge, and this is the problem. I will continue to the next paragraph.
I was going to say, I think Ken is too busy looking at the benefits of a family life work environment.
And we all know work is family, don't you know? Do everything for your family. Don't join a union. They're not your family, we are. Yet, this is what psychoanalysis does when it closets itself in Oedipus and determines its progressions and regressions in terms of Oedipus, or even in relationship to it. Thus, the idea of pre-Oedipal regression, by means of which one sometimes attempts to characterize psychosis. It is like a Cartesian devil. The regressions and progressions are made only within the artificially closed vessel of Oedipus, and in reality depend on a state of forces that is changing, yet always actual and contemporary, within Oedipal desiring production. Desiring production has solely an actual existence. Progressions and regressions are merely the effectuations of a virtual that is always fulfilled as perfectly as it can be by virtue of the states of desire. Rarely have psychiatrists and psychoanalysts been able to establish a really inspired direct relationship with either child or adult schizophrenics. Gisela Pankau and Bruno Bettelheim break new ground in this area by the force of their theory and the efficacy of their therapy. It is not by chance that both of them call into question the notion of regression. Taking the example of the bodily cares administered to a schizophrenic, massages, baths, swathings, Gisela Pankau asks if it is a matter of reaching the invalid at the point of his regression. The invalid, I'm going to re-say that. Gisela Pankau asks if it is a matter of reaching the invalid at the point of his regression in order to give him indirect symbolic satisfactions that would allow him to resume a progression, to take up a progressive pace. It is not at all a question, she says, of administering care that the schizophrenic presumably did not receive when he was a baby. It is a question of giving the patient tactile and other bodily sensations that lead him to a recognition of the limits of his body. It is a question of the recognition of an unconscious desire, and not of this desire's satisfaction. Recognizing the desire is tantamount to setting desiring production back into motion on the body without organs, in the very place to which the schizo had retreated, in order to silence and suffocate this production. This recognition of desire, this position of desire, this sign refers to an order of real and actual productivity that is not to be confused with an indirect or symbolic satisfaction, and that, in its stops as in its starts, is as distinct from the pre-Oedipal regression as from progressive restoration of Oedipus. I'm going to just quote you there again. The pre-Oedipal is a fantasy that justifies the Oedipal. Yes, this is, they talk about that's a great way to put it. They talk about it a bunch inside of this section, but also before, the way that it sort of becomes the thing we create other things around in order to continue to prove its existence as if it is in a vacuum. Well, this is Oedipalized because everything has to fit within it. Suddenly the pre-Oedipal ultimately exists just to fulfill the thing we already believe. It's a great way of putting it. I like that. And now we are at the end. That's the end. Hey, look at that. 1 day for this one. This one took 2 weeks last time. Maybe 3. Shit, 3. Any questions about this entire section? Let's open it up. We're here. Why do they refer to desire as a capitalized sign? Rimka, that is a really good question, actually. Let me find my copy. Make sure that that's the case in the hard copy as well, because this PDF is wonky. Jack, if you want to talk, go for it.
Let me go back. I think that's a reference to the third paralogism.
You mean the critique of representation, lack, displacement?
Yeah, they say this is 111. The 3 errors concerning desire are called lack, law, and signifier. One and the same error, and idealism forms a pious conception of the unconscious. But yeah, I took that because they go on to say, right, and the signifier into a distributor and no longer a meaning. For these notions cannot be prevented from dragging their theological cortege behind insufficiency of being, guilt, signification. So it looks like what they're talking about there with the capital S sign is they're talking about subjectivity and hey everyone, subjectivity and the third synthesis there, but in terms of the paralogism.
Yeah, it's as I read it, it's not that they're referring to desire itself as a sign, but instead the recognition and the position of desire. That sign refers to an order of real and actual productivity. The recognition of the desire and the position of it. That's the thing that they're talking about here. Because they're talking about the schizo jumping back on the body without organs and being able to return because he's able to once again begin the process. And that process is, if you think of, I would say it like this: massages, baths, and swathings, as Pankow was talking about it, are kind of, if we want to talk about a person kind of being like a car, this is the jump start. Like, doing those things are ways of connecting, finding what their body is, redeveloping their body without organs, making those connections immediate, real, and actual. And that's what bodies do, because we're talking about, again, connecting. A massage and all of those things would be an extraordinary number of connections happening constantly. This kind of thing allows the process of all of this to sort of restart, desiring production to begin again, because all we need is connection. Connection in the first syntheses is not just connecting, it is simultaneous connecting and desiring production at the same time. So it's a little bit of a push to desiring production to sort of start again, rather than the opposite, which is essentially what they're talking about heavily here, where we're saying, pushing someone back on the BWO and collapsing them because we want them to be Oedipalized. That's why the schizo does that. They can't connect to anything. Their connections stop. You're halting the machine as it's moving. fuel stopped with everything else. You can't have connections without the desiring production, and desiring production requires connections and disconnections. They're not like, I would say that they're symbiotic, but that's assuming that they're two things. They're not. It's an immediate, intense, singular of both of them. And so when you basically are putting them inside of Oedipalization, or any of us really, you're basically defining how we can connect. And as soon as you start defining that, like, connections aren't really happening anymore. They use the example of the child who starts getting confused. Well, can I touch that? Is that part of family? Is this mine? Is that mine? And this immediately starts cascading. And the schizo just shuts down, becomes catatonic, lost. Because they're on their own body without organs. They're hiding there. There's just no production happening. So by jumping back in and going, well, we're going to do massages and baths and these other bits of essentially touch therapy, which is what it is a chance for people to start that process back up and to kickstart their battery going again.
Yeah, and I should add to that, like, the difference between the signifier and the sign, right? So this is page 112. Put back under the yoke of despotism was a fact is castration. There where one recognizes the stroke of the signifier itself. But the sign of desire is never signified. It exists in the thousands of productive break flows that never allow themselves to be signified with the unary stroke of castration. It is always a point sign of many directions. Polyvacity is the basis of a punctual semiology. We are on page 130. But I think that's the tension they're highlighting, is the tension of the third. I mean, when we're talking about the third synthesis, right? We're going to be looking at all three, right? But particularly the way that distribution and consumption and consummation play a role in these in the assemblage here.
Please, any other questions, thoughts? So I'll give my short summary. I'll give it a shot. These last few sections, and some of them have been very long, this is about talking how representation, we've been using Oedipus as the example of it, but we're talking about how such a thing interacts with the unconscious, how such a thing plays within the unconscious. With Oedipus, and how it plays with the connecting of desiring machines, the disconnecting of them, and the creation of signs on the body without organs, as what Campbell said, we're coming back around to that. And then now talking about kind of the afterword, as they say it, which is the sort of assumption of the whole person that places social repression itself second to psychic repression. That our problems are coming solely from within. We need to work on ourselves, be triangulated and Oedipalized. We need to see a doctor. It's my fault, my problems, my family as I was growing up, blah, blah, blah. But as they talk about, we're talking about ultimately desiring machines that fuels all of it. And we're finally coming to that. Desiring machines are fueling the whole thing. Desiring machines are part of it. So let's actually talk about how they operate. Let's realize that such a thing as Oedipus can only exist as a result, as a reaction to desiring machines. That it's built by desiring machines. The form is made by desiring machines. However it's made, that's still the case. So we need to step back and not talk about how Oedipus, or representation, is this sort of core nature and the thing that forms us, but let's talk about how we actually create the thing that forms Oedipus. That's my takeaway, since no one else is talking.
Yeah, I'm curious about what the status of the internal is for Deleuze and Guattari.
Meaning,
I don't know. That's the thing, because like I'm going through difference in repetition, and he uses internal there sometimes, and like difference in itself. But you know, this whole problem with suggesting um, the Oedipus as an internal thing, like you have in ecology, you have like this thing called the chronosystem, where you have like a microsystem, and then a few layers, and then the macro system being like the cultural order or something. But putting Oedipus in the microsystem um, is a problem.
I don't think that's what they're doing.
No, yeah, I'm not. I'm just trying to flesh it out. I think they're doing the opposite of that in a way, saying that Oedipus is somehow maintained, quote unquote, externally, but but I don't see how. You know, I favor the whole non-orientable surface thing, where inside and outside are sort of just totally contingent, and there's nothing necessary. They're almost faculties of identification. So I was just wondering what the status of internal and external is for. It's an open question. I have no idea. You know how
Well, I'm generally hesitant to say that they believe in even internal or external. Their whole entire thing around molecular and molar, I think, would be the closest that they come to saying such a thing. I think they use these terms to be like internal and external because they're topographical more than anything, and again, terms that are a little bit easier to sort of grasp what they're trying to say. But to me, it like Oedipus, the way they're describing it, it's if there is a place where social repression and structures have a pressure down, and desiring machines almost are continually pushing up, where they meet, where they slam together, that sort of space right there that's a little fuzzy and not really either molar or molecular, that's where the formation of Oedipus starts being made by the combination of a family that is sort of molding me, society that is molding me, my desires pointing upwards, and the generalized incentivizations of the way I'm being raised and all of that.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I think it's going to depend there, because the molar molecular is one way of distinguishing two regimes, right? Just like social production and desiring production are two ways of distinguishing regimes. But if you mean it in like the personal and the collective sense, like the way I think about it is because they have a point where they say like I believe they say something to the effect of, obviously the personal and conscious is insufficient, but so too is the collective, right? Because I think what they try to argue is that desire flows with the unconscious as they're conceiving it, right? Desire moves in and out of what we would want to call a personal, collective, unconscious, right? So you're always in a collective, you're always in like a collective assemblage, is Guattari to later call it, right? And so whatever, what's happening to you is happening in this context, and there's connections there, right? And so I don't think you have anything like, if you mean internal, I don't know if it would always, I don't think you can have anything purely individual where there's no like social context or social relationship. But likewise, everything social, right? There would be no, because it all seems to move in and out for them.
Yeah, I mean, I will go as far as to say that the body itself is a collective, right? Because the body, in and of itself, expresses an entire evolutionary history. And you can sort of see Deleuze's vulgarized Leibnizianism in this, but in that expression of an entire history, it's already a collective body as well, despite just being, on our sort of sensible level, one collective body. But in the depths, it's going to be just this mass process involving many other things.
So the problem there is a vulgar Leibnizianism is a Newtonian calculus rather.
See, this is what I mean. No one should listen to what you're saying.
That's the best joke I'll tell all week.
And we'll get into the difficulty with using a term like individuals inside of something like this is we aren't there yet. We aren't talking yet about, like, we've only had the conception and talk a little bit about the creation of the subject and how it works within different people. Saying that things are different between individuals, absolutely. Like, there's a reality to that in terms of treatment, for example, in terms of, there's a lot of that. The question of whether something is shared or not between individuals starts getting into that, okay, there's a larger chat to have with all of that, with the implications sort of across multiple books from Deleuze and Guattari and multiple bits of reading from a lot of people. I'm more hesitant to say we should dive into that right now. It's a great question, though. Like, it's getting really at the core of what they're talking about here, which is, again, the ego, which is naturally the Freudian way. The ego is made, the triangle, the ego, id, and superego. And everyone just naturally needs to learn, that they shouldn't fuck their mom because they really want to. They also want to kill their dad. They need to learn not to do that. They need to learn these things because they already have this pre-designed set of desires. And they're like, no, desire is powering that. Can we talk about desire and realize that that formation was actually something that's made after desire has already been produced? And if that's the case, we need to step away from the idea that Oedipus is a thing, that the pre-Oedipal is like a real thing, that we need to actually talk about how these things function and how it all works. And like get really to the material realities of psychiatry. Just real quick, like right now, I'm just taking a break. The Chauvin trial is right now. Guilty. Chauvin's guilty. That's good. It's not a bad day. Screw that guy.
What are they guilty of? What?
Let's go through it right now. He got second-degree murder, I think. Jesus Christ, a couple of them? 2021 at 1:45 p.m. 34 persons, 019. Members of the jury, I'm now going to ask you individually if
Guy that George Floyd.
Yeah, it's a George Floyd verdict. Goddamn city would have burned down if they didn't do that. And I would have probably been very happy about it. So this guy, that's on at least two of the counts. I'm reading it right now. It looks like it's at least two of the counts, which means he's going away for a while. Shit's going. He got second degree, third degree, and second degree manslaughter, I think, all of them. Which is just like, fucking A. Good. Yeah, guilty on all three? Alright, cool. Well, with that, I'm gonna go ahead and close up the recording. I should have probably closed it up before I had that ramble just now. Thank all of you for joining. As always, phenomenal discussions. It's always exciting to have, and I thank all of you for coming every week. Next week, we will be diving into the process, which is 2.9, which starts to get into a little bit further of what we were talking about here today, which is great. So thank all of you for joining us, and I look forward to it. Bye-bye.